Hi everyone, Deacon Ed McCormick here on a beautiful fall day at St. John the Baptist Catholic Community. And this Sunday we heard the story of these 10 lepers approaching Jesus and asking for mercy. And they leave healed, one comes back and gives praise and thanks to God. And you can see how these lepers demonstrate faith that Jesus will heal them. Faith that God will work through Jesus. But more than that, the presence of Jesus for these sick outcasts meant hope. They were living hopeless lives, and his presence brought them hope for a possible future they couldn't have imagined. And I want to talk to you today about hope. In my last video, I talked about faith. In this one, I'm going to talk to you about Christian hope, and I'm going to draw a great deal on the work of Professor David Kelsey from Yale to help us understand what we mean by Christian hope and what it means to practice that hope. Here's the first thing that I want you to understand. Christian hope is a response to the death and resurrection of Jesus. Christian hope is a response to what God has begun to do for us and for the cosmos by raising Jesus from the dead, by transforming his dead body into a living, transformed body. And this kind of hope, based on the resurrection, is not the same as our kind of middle-class optimism, the myth of progress, that things will just get better and better. I think that myth is dead in the face of our climate crisis. But there is this kind of American middle-class optimism. And that's not the same as Christian hope. Christian hope is based on what God has begun to do through the death and resurrection of Jesus. And of course, this requires a much more robust view and insight into the resurrection of Jesus than we normally have. The resurrection of Jesus is, first of all, the very life of God poured into the dead body of Jesus. And from among all the dead, Jesus is raised, meaning that he now lives this transformed bodily existence with God, and that through him, the rest of creation will one day share in this transformation that he experienced. So that the resurrection is a promise on God's part to complete what God has begun. And so Christian hope is, first of all, a response to what God has begun to do. And this response takes the form of an attitude or disposition of expectation. Because we believe God has defeated evil, that God has raised Jesus from the dead and begun to transform all things, we can have this attitude of expectation that orients us in how we relate to everyday life and to God. And it's crucial that we understand this, that this response to the resurrection is an attitude. It's not an inner feeling that comes and goes. It's an attitude or disposition that orients us to life and to God. And here's what's key about this attitude, this expectation. It's one of joy. Not glee, not silly excitement, but a quiet joy. David Kelsey talks about joyous hopefulness. Now, the source of this joy is the resurrection. Because what the resurrection means is that the life of God has poured into our present age, into our dark and present age. What the prophets promised God would do in the future, God has begun to do now in this present age. And so the joy of the resurrection is that death doesn't have the last word. That there's a power, a force that is healing and liberating and freeing, that opens up a possible future that would not be possible in our dark and dangerous world without the life of God invading this world. And so hope is a response to the resurrection. And this response is an attitude or disposition of expectation. We're expecting God to act as God did at the resurrection. We expect God to continue to act. And this produces in us a quiet joy. Now, I want to share with you two images from the New Testament that help orient or help us to understand how to act out of this joy, because it involves practices, it involves action. In the New Testament, two images dominate. One comes from Jesus, the kingdom of God has arrived. The second comes from St. Paul and from John's Gospel, and that is God's new creation. Both of these images speak about the public and social mission of God coming into our world to engage and liberate and transform all of society and all of creation. Kingdom of God is a political metaphor. It refers to the extension of power. If we were to talk about the kingdom of Herod or the kingdom of Caesar, we're talking about the extent of his power. And so when Jesus uses the idea of the kingdom of God, it's not simply this interior thing. No, it means that God is coming, and this involves regime change. The coming of the kingdom means every dimension of society and creation will be changed. The second metaphor that Paul draws from Isaiah the prophet is of God's new creation, a new heaven and a new earth. That with the death and resurrection of Jesus, God is creating all things anew. Notice this is a cosmic metaphor. And so the point here of emphasizing these two images is that Christian hope is a hope for the transformation of society and of all of creation. Now, we are called, we who share in this hope, to cooperate with God's public mission. We are called to engage in communal and personal practices that anticipate the coming of God's kingdom and anticipate the coming of God's new creation. Now, a couple of things about these practices I want you to notice. The first is this: they are celebratory. They are Eucharistic. We should be engaging in practices that celebrate the good news that God's kingdom, God's new creation, is coming into our world and our lives. And secondly, these practices, these communal and personal practices, should be about the liberation of all peoples from suffering and from all socially and culturally constructed systems that oppress and enslave. And thirdly, then, we're going to need social critique. Remember, the response of hope is an attitude of expectancy. We expect the impact of the resurrection to change all things. And in the light of the resurrection, we can suddenly see where injustices, where violences, where greed, where all these idolatries are. So we need social critique to motivate our actions to liberate people from injustice and suffering. And finally, we need discernment. Now, my last point here on this large subject. As I said at the beginning, our hope is based on the resurrection of Jesus, that into the old creation, with its corruption and violence and darkness, has come the light of God's new creation. And so right now, the old and new creations exist simultaneously, and therefore, the ways in which God is at work in your life and mine in the world are hidden, can be hard to see. And that's why we need witness, we need discernment, we need the support of each other. Next time, we'll get into the topic of love. See you then.